Hi, welcome to part 2 of my review featuring Wallace. If you haven't seen part 1, please check out the link in the description below. With the main adventure divided in 3 acts, you notice something that is quite fun, quite surprising, and it is the inclusion of random event tables. You can determine many things randomly. Of course, you have the freedom to choose the sorts of events and happenings that go on during the action of Lanark, but if you want to handle things completely randomly, you have all sorts of tables for that. You have background information, of course, on the start of the battle. Sheriff William de Heselrig governs Lanark and the surrounding areas in the stead of King Edward. De Heselrig is an English nobleman in his middle years and is practiced in warfare, of course, so you have information on the entire garrison of Lanark, with 50 English soldiers patrolling and guarding the place. So many Scots are fearful of Heselrig's force, so it will require a great cunning on the part of the player characters and great actions to encourage them to fight. They tell you about the structure of the castle, how it is secured by a gate, and the palisade walls are manned day and night. You also have a flying bridge that separates the valley from the motte and the keep. You have information on when the soldiers rest, when they patrol and eat, so all of this must be taken into consideration if the player characters perhaps want to infiltrate Lanark in more subtle ways. You can determine the morning events randomly. Maybe there is bad weather, execution, sickness, death and taxes, or an unexplained death. You have subtables for each of these events. For example, in the case of bad weather, maybe there is heavy fog, and this will help the player characters if they want to approach things more stealthily. Or maybe there are muddy streets, so some battles and actions will be considerably more difficult. Because of this, they could slip and fall. And perhaps the weather has damaged the castle, perhaps the outer gate or the keep. So this means that the player characters could perhaps avoid some areas that are just too patrolled by guards and workers, but they could also find some wholesome openings in the damaged structure to sneak in more easily. But what if you obtained execution as a result? Maybe Marion Braveheart is going to be executed this very day, and he's going to spur William Wallace into action. But what if William Wallace himself is about to be executed? Will the player characters be able to save him, or will he die? And then the player characters take the role that William Wallace historically took. There could also be other non-player characters that are going to be executed this day, such as John Abels, or Kirk and Kenny Gilday. There is even the possibility of Marion Braveheart leading the rebellion because she wants to avenge William Wallace. And what if you obtained the sickness result? Maybe the sickness is widespread or moderate, so depending, the player characters could perhaps disguise themselves as doctors trying to go into Lanark with the excuse of treating the sick. But what if the player characters themselves end up sick? In that case, you're going to suffer some penalties to your different checks. If you obtain the death and taxes roll, maybe some people want to avoid paying taxes. Some non-player characters could be kicked out of the castle, such as Kirk and Kenny Gilday. Or maybe the player characters are in trouble because they haven't paid their taxes, but maybe they could run some errands or perform some other sort of service to pay their taxes in alternative ways. This could also serve as an excuse to maneuver themselves through the castle of Lanark. Now, what if there was an unexpected death in the castle? Maybe a non-player character such as John Abels dies, and Brother Edwin, who laments his death, asks the player characters to investigate into this matter to find out if it was a natural death or not, and this could create some sort of alliance or connection between the player characters and Brother Edwin. But what if Sir Thomas Grey dies? Maybe the player characters are considered suspects, that they somehow arranged or planned his death. So this is going to make things quite challenging. You also have tables to determine the event length. Maybe an event that happens in Act 1 lasts all the way to Act 2 or even Act 3. You also have a table to determine if there is a spy. Maybe the Heselrig was a spy all along, sent by the English because they were wary that perhaps a Scottish noble would act against them. So the Heselrig probably suspects of William Wallace. But what if another remarkable character ends up as a spy, perhaps Robert the Bruce? He is carrying out covert operations against the English, and perhaps the characters become secret agents for Robert the Bruce. You also have information on how to integrate Wallace into this action, of course. After all, it is his legendary moment, so unless one of the players participates as William Wallace, You will have to look at this information concerning his ambition, or perhaps his duty or his love as a driving force, and to see how that plays out with the player character's interactions with him. You also have a sequence of events where the player characters are introduced to William Wallace and they start to plot and plan with him, finally taking resolution to act. This moves us into Act 2. After the initial meeting with Wallace and any events that occur are settled in Act 1, the party of adventurers that are now working with William Wallace, or perhaps they are working on their own if William Wallace died during Act 1, they need to analyze the castle defenses and the features. What is required for them to perhaps infiltrate the castle through the outer gate? Are they going to strike as silent assassins in the dark? Or are they going to use more direct means? For example, raising a sizable force and using a battering ram. In order to accomplish this, you have details on the outer walls, the interior of the buildings. Perhaps the characters want to send someone ahead as a scout for some reconnaissance. You also have information on the inner gate, the inner walls, and the keep itself. Perhaps they could pinpoint the location of key non-player characters that they need to assassinate, or perhaps befriend, or at the very least, persuade them to become their allies. You also have details on ramifications and outcomes. Many things could go off rails quite quickly. Perhaps the player characters end up arrested, so you have information on how the player characters could attempt their escape. Perhaps they are being chased down. And you also have random tables to determine this, of course. For example, if the player characters have made friends in the Valley, do these individuals have access to the barracks, or do they hold any sort of influence within Lanark? Perhaps these allies or friends within the castle could release the player characters if they are imprisoned in exchange for some riches, or perhaps just as an act of patriotism. You also have a table to determine when Wallace seeks aid. Who is he going to ask help from? Perhaps from commoners? Or even nobles? You also have stats for some non-player characters that could play into this equation, such as Sir Coulson Macduff, a young and energetic man hailing from Fife. He recently received his knighthood and he is eager to join the Scottish cause against the English. You also have more general stats for Scottish warriors. You also have a table to randomly determine the situation between the English and the player characters. Maybe the English are clueless to the actions of Wallace and the player characters, or perhaps they suspect them and they are hounding them. You also have information how to handle complications. Maybe a group of English soldiers arrive to resupply and rest in Castle Lanark, so things are going to be more challenging. Or maybe there are refugees. Scots seek a respite as they flee from a nearby location that has been ravaged by war. So they would add to the ranks of Scots, and perhaps they could be potentially rallied to the cause of William Wallace. After all of these actions have been done, and when a sizable force has been recruited, or if the player characters want to handle things in a more creative, alternative way, Act 3 will proceed. It is important to note that this adventure is not exactly linear. Many things could change, could happen in surprising ways. Maybe the player characters and William Wallace end up defeated in Act 1 or 2, or perhaps they manage to defeat the entire English garrison in Act 1 or 2. But nonetheless, you have information here for when, after all that planning, the player characters and William Wallace gather enough resources and allies for a more straightforward assault against Lanark's garrison. You have information how to attack the gate. Maybe you are abandoned and the forces that you supposedly mustered do not show up, so now you need to either escape or carry out the plan on your own through subtle and stealthy means, or perhaps even in more daredevil ways. So Act 3 is mainly the climax or resolution of all of the preparations that were undertaken during Act 1 and 2. And of course, depending on your results, on your defeat or triumph, this could be the start of a long campaign. Near the end of the book, you have a setting primer, giving you advice on how to run the setting with a timeline of events. You also have information on popular inaccuracies. If you watched the film Braveheart and you do not know much about the historical reality of the conflict, you really need to read this section. You also have details on future events so that you can further develop the campaign. You have information, for example, the Battle of Stirling Bridge. You have information and stats on other characters such as Andrew Moray of Petty, Sir John Comyn III of Badenoch. You also have information on the knighting of William Wallace, and the invasion of northern England, and the Battle of Falkirk. You also have details on political intrigue in general around this time, more information on the English occupation, and you even have stats and details on Robert the Bruce and the fate of Wallace. Now, I have some criticisms when it comes to the stats for Robert the Bruce. He was obviously quite a skilled horseman and a deadly axe wielder. In fact, he actually had a favorite axe. This is showcased in the Battle of Bannockburn when he faces off against the knight the Vohun. Robert the Bruce stood his ground and he managed to accomplish something exceptionally difficult, which is defeating an opponent using a hand axe against a lance. The lance has great advantage against shorter weapons, so it shows that the Bruce was an incredible axe wielder and an expert horse rider. But his stats, he only has 1 when it comes to riding skills, and he has not a single point in skills with an axe, so that's a bit disappointing. You also have more details covering other characters and other events such as the murder in Greyfriars Church, the War of Robert the Bruce. If you want to play things all over to that sequence of events, you can do that. And of course, there's the Battle of Bannockburn, but I highly recommend that you modify the Bruce's stats if you are playing as him or if you are going to have him as an ally. Definitely modify his stats, giving him better riding skills and adding the axe skill, so that he is a better representation of his real persona. So overall, what do I think of Wallace? This is a very good mini-campaign setting. It is just a start of what is a more complex and longer conflict, but it's sufficient for you to further develop things. I think that it's excellent that there are so many ramifications, possibilities, alternative ways in which the different acts can be handled. You do not need to stick to the historical reality. It is possible for the Game Master to steer things into a more historical direction, but if you want to handle things a bit more heroically or completely different from what is seen in book records, you can do that. You have the information for that here. And after all, many history books throughout the ages have been modified by the victors and later on by different academics according to their politics and their agendas. So there is no wrong way to run this adventure setting. I also think that there is potential in this adventure setting to run things as a cooperative or solo experience that is without a game master. If you have a game master emulator of preference, all of the random tables contained here to determine different outcomes and events throughout the entire sequence of acts, they are going to be incredibly useful, very handy to use them with your favorite game master emulator, and perhaps even to replace some event generation tables from that emulator. So I highly recommend that you get Wallace. I am really happy I got the opportunity to review this document because I am a fan of William Wallace. There are other exceptional Scottish characters throughout history, such as Robert the Bruce, but there is something that was said once that I think summarizes why I like Wallace above Robert the Bruce. And it is the following. Robert the Bruce always had his eyes on the crown of Scotland, while William Wallace always had his eyes on the people of Scotland. And I think there is a lot of educational value to this document. Not only do you learn more about Scotland's history, you also have the ever so important concept of freedom. And there are lessons to be learned. For example, do not trust those that play police or judges in lands that are not their own. And do not trust those that descend from the Plantagenet bloodline. Edward I was of the House Plantagenet. If you take a look at the different presidents and prime ministers throughout the years up to recent times, you'll find some interesting common threads in their family trees. That's the reason why the world is in so much chaos. I'm going to put a link in the description below to a video that gives you more information about the Plantagenet. Well, thanks for watching my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. And thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending DriveThruRPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you and see you later.